This week on CloudTrail, let's get into some Athena queries. Okay, this week we're going to do the lesson in the lab all at the same time. We're going to skip to the fun part and combine things. Why? Because usually I use the lesson section to focus on core principles and then the lab to put those in action. But for today's topic, it just makes more sense to walk you through some basic queries as we explore the structure of CloudTrail instead of having you read about it and then, stare at it on a screen. Today, we're going to dig into CloudTrail and we're going to focus on searching on and extracting the key data that we use in threat detectors and incident analysis. CloudTrail logs and events have a consistent structure, but since every AWS service is run by a different team and the team generates their own CloudTrail events, there's enough variation to be kind of annoying at times. It isn't all that bad once you learn some basics, and that's our focus today, and we'll go more into the details as we go on and do more of these kinds of labs. Remember that a CloudTrail log entry is a record of an API call, and every API call includes an identity, an action, and the parameters of that action, such as delete this as 3object. And then maybe you're going to get a response from AWS. Most API calls have a response, but some of them don't. You'll also have some metadata like what region are you in, what is the source IP address of the request, and those kinds of things. All right, so enough talking, let's kind of get into it. And so first thing we need to do is actually make a couple of API calls so that we have some log entries that we can dig into. So I want everybody to go into your sign-in portal, and then we're going to go into sign-in portal, test account 1, administrator access. We're going to keep things simple and just run a basic instance, let it boot up, and then we'll go ahead and terminate that instance. That'll give us enough to work with. So go to EC2. And then we're going to click on the launch instance button. And we're going to give it a name. Actually, we don't even need to, maybe, can't remember if it requires. Just call it delete and just leave everything else as a default and click launch instance. We're going to proceed without a key pair and launch the instance. It's not something we're going to be able to log into or do anything else. Now that instance is booting up. If I go back to instances, we can see that that instance, the state is now running, but it's still in that initialization state. And you can see it updated. So I'll hit that refresh button. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll just be hitting that refresh button until we get some results. And I'd like you to go ahead and just do the same thing. Okay, I let that run for just a couple of minutes. The status check's still initializing. I don't even care about the status checks for this one. Let's go ahead, click on the instance, go to instance state and terminate. And we also want to delete everything, blah, blah, blah. Yep, we're going to terminate, delete everything. And now it's going to shut down and terminate. I don't even need to stay on this page anymore. We now have the log entries that we need because we've issued the commands. And I'm going to go ahead and close this window. All right, so we generated what we need, and it should show up in our centralized CloudTrail within about 5 minutes. So you can go ahead, take 5 minutes, do what you want. No, not that. Never mind. Just I'll see you in a few minutes, which will be like instantaneous because I have the magic pause button. Okay, so let's just set up a basic scenario. This is going to be contrived, but it's designed to work well for this lab and to give us something quick and dirty to work with. Imagine you get a call from a scared intern who noticed that a critical EC2 instance is not there anymore and the entire internet is down. I mean, this is the sort of thing that these interns tend to do if you ever read breach reports, but in this case, the intern swears they didn't touch anything. In fact, they were at the beach when it went down, and please don't tell their manager. Also, they have no idea who even owns the instance. They just know the internet is down and their little brother can't watch Bluey, and this is really, really bad. I mean, that doesn't really make any sense, but you're not here because I'm a writer of like strong fiction novels. All right, where do we start? Well, if we think about it, we want to know who terminated the instance and when. That's the reason it's not there anymore. And we need to figure out the owner. So we can usually get that from who originally launched the instance, which can indicate who owned it. And then we want to maybe figure out, was this a mistake or did somebody hack something? And we don't even have the instance ID to work with at this point. So we need to really kind of go in blind and start tracing things back. And again, it's really contrived and it barely makes sense, but I was up at 4:40 this morning for one of my work calls. So that's the best you're going to get. So we're going to start by running a query to find recently terminated instances and order them with the most recent at top. As a reminder, we only have 3 months of our CloudTrail logs anyway, and I'll show you where you could put in a time period to make things. It'll make sense when we get there. So that should help narrow it down. And you're going to notice in my query that I'm searching based only on the action of terminate instances. And let's go ahead and take. Back from your sign-in portal, we need to go into our security audit account because that's where we had all of our Athena set up. And if I recall, we set up so it only works with security full admin to have the appropriate privileges. So I'm now logged into that account and we'll go to Athena. Look at that. It even has my my last queries in there. That's kind of funny. I thought they were going to disappear more quickly. Let's go ahead. We're going to close query 2. Don't show that message again. And query 1, we're going to just use query 1, but we're going to overwrite it. So I'm going to go ahead over to the blog post. I'm going to copy and paste the query that we want. Now, although I pasted it in, remember, we need to change the name of our table. And so if I click on this here, whoops, and it's going to be CloudTrail underscore logs organization underscore trail like we did last time. So let me go ahead and get that in there. And as a reminder, first you list the database, so CloudTrail logs, and then organization trail. Now let me run you through this query a little bit. I did already run it, and it took about 47 seconds. Remember, we are not partitioned, so things run inefficiently. And so I just selected a bunch of the columns, and we'll actually go ahead and look at those. But those are a bunch of the critical columns that we have here. And this is a common starting point for an incident investigation. If we know something bad happened, we look for that specific API call if we happen to know what that is. And in this case, we did. There's usually like 3 entry points and event. The actual action, which comes in as the event name, is one of those common entry points. The other is if we have a resource identifier or if we have an identity identifier. Now, most of the fields are really obvious. Notice that if we actually look at the user identity, we actually extracted some information from it because the user identity has a lot of information inside of it. If you look at a raw CloudTrail log, it's just got a big blob of stuff in there. And I'll put the full log entry for this particular event. I'll go back and get that. You'll be able to look at that in the blog post. So, but here we're just extracting a few things. What kind of user was it? The principal ID, the user ARN, and the user name. But then we get the region, the request parameters, and the response elements we'll be getting to here in just a moment. Now, you do want to be careful when you do your own queries because things like in the user identity field, these are always there, but there may be on occasion because of the inconsistencies in how some things run, there may actually be fields that don't exist and you don't want to cause some errors or you're just not going to get the appropriate results. We'll get into that much later. Don't worry too much about it. Now, most of these are pretty obvious, but there's 2 that become really important, the request parameters and the response elements. So let me go down and show you what these look like. So I'm going to scroll over all the way across the field to the ARN, and you can see that the request parameters, there's a bunch of information in here. This is the API call itself. So for the terminate instances, you'll see here we have the instance ID because it was a request to terminate a single instance. And then some other things that are the console inserted that would be part of that particular API call. So request parameters is what were the things in the API call? And the response elements is what is the return information from the API call? And so here the return information is it updated the state, and that's about it. There's basically there's a state change from running, and now the state change is shutting down, and then it'll be terminating and terminated, I think are the next ones. So This is pretty important because these are going to vary a lot depending on what the actual API call is, because you're putting in the different parameters of the API call, and then the response is whatever that service owner decided they want to give you as your response from that API call, to show it in the console or to show it when you're running on the command line. Now, there's kind of a bummer here, because although there's sometimes a field that for the resources called resources, it's almost always missing or empty. Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. You would think for every API call, it'd give you a resource ID or the IDs of those resources. And it doesn't work that way for whatever reason. And I think it's because sometimes you're making a request on a specific resource, but in other cases, you're going to request, you're going to see this in a moment. So that was like here, we terminated the instance. And because we terminated the instance, we gave it the exact instance that we wanted terminated. But in other cases, we don't have an ID yet. So like run instances, the first thing we did. So you can see we're kind of working backwards here. And in that case, we're saying run an instance. We don't give it the ID. AWS creates and generates and gives us the ID. You don't get to pick your own instance ID. So that's why if you're doing things searching on individual resources, and I'm going to show you how to do that, you do need to look in those different places. I will always look in the request parameters and the response elements. And that leads us to our second common starting point. Sometimes we're going to start based on an event. In this case, we're starting based on a specific resource, and we want to see all the activity based on that resource. So, okay, let me clean up my language a little bit. We started by looking for that event terminate instances. If an instance disappears, that's going to be the most common reason why. So going back to our investigation of why did that thing disappear? Great. Now we have an instance ID. Now I can't go in and look at the instance because it doesn't exist anymore. But what I can do is look for all of the API calls associated with that instance. It's going to give me the full life cycle of that instance, ideally, or at least for the 3 months that we have our logs saved. And as part of that, it's going to give me a sense of who originally launched that instance. So when you're looking for API calls for every API call on a resource, you have to look in both the request parameters and in the response elements. And since both of those fields embed other fields, the way I handle it is I do it as a like search and with wildcards. So go over to the blog post. You're going to see the second query in there, and I'm going to copy that out. I'm going to paste it in here, and we'll see what that does. First thing you want to do is scroll back up. So we now actually have our query here, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. So we're going to leave that query. Let's hit the plus sign so we have our query too. Now I'm going to pause the video, go over to the blog post. Why do I pause the video when I do that? Because I haven't finished writing the blog post. You guys don't want to see my ugly draft. And then I'm going to come back in here and we'll run that query. So I'm going to paste it in and I'm going to hit that run button. Okay, in my case, I already updated that query. I'm going to paste it in. And the key here is that I added in that instance ID, and I put that in both the request parameters and the response elements. And this is that key. So like means it's going to give you a like match. Doesn't need to be necessarily fully exact. And in SQL queries, that % sign is this the wildcard character. So basically, as long as this appears anywhere in the request parameters or anywhere in the response elements, we're going to get our results. And again, I'm looking for largely the same fields as I had up before. And you can play with this, play with different fields. And if you want to know what fields to play with, they're right here. So you can see actually that that's all the user identity struct. That's everything that could potentially be in the user identity and all the various other fields that we can look at. And then remember, this resources field is almost never propagated. That's the weird thing about this. All right, let me run the query and then I'm going to pause because it will take about 45 seconds for this to run. Okay, we got some results here. Completed, runtime. Hey, 34 seconds. It went faster this time. And let's see what we got. Look at all these events associated with this interest with this instance. And this is pretty cool. So that one instance ID, even all we did was launch it, and all we did is terminate it. Look, it has all of these API calls. All right, so let me go through. Let's look at what they were here. And you'll notice that they're like out of order. So these are ordered by time. But why does this look so weird? Look at these timestamps right here. These are really all clumped together because of how the API calls kind of go and how quickly things are happening on the back end. So let me go ahead and sort it in order. And if I go all the way to the bottom, so this is reverse order. So the first API call was run instances. And if I scroll over to see, well, who ran that instance, I can see that it was our mogul user. So it was assumed role, that administrator access role, and the user from IAM Identity Center is our mogul. So that's probably the owner of the instance. All right. Well, let's scroll up. And who terminated the instance? Terminate the instances, and whoops, it's our mogul. So you get to blame our mogul for the death of Bluey. I think that's just the only conclusion here. Okay. So these results are pretty cool because you get the region. You can see that the username field is not propagated. That just has to deal with the fact that we're not using an IAM user. So in some cases, that's going to be empty. If you want to see the full results in a second, I'll just show you the full results. I'm going to pull the identity. I'll show you everything in that particular identity field. Now, why do we have all these describe instances? Well, anytime you're looking in the console, anytime you're showing it on screen, you're going to see describe instances API calls. What about these describe instance attributes? Again, these are all things largely that occur, in this case, internally. Oh, nope, it was because of our mogul just clicking on things in the console there. Now, these are all my actions, but the console hid a lot of it. And again, when you're in the console, you're just going to see tons of these. If I were going via API call, you would just see all the individual actions. But this is great. We have the full history of that instance. You can see when I launched it with the run instances API call, and then you can see when it was terminated with the terminate instances API call. And you even get to see all of the read activity, which is not what you would normally see if you go into the console and you're actually looking inside a CloudTrail. Also remember that we're searching across every account that we have. And as much as it's inefficient and it took a bunch of time to do that search, and again, if you're at enterprise scale, you're going to be doing all sorts of other things to get performance out of it. In our case, that timing is totally fine, totally appropriate for learning considerations. Now, going back in here, boy, I say now a lot, don't I? As I'm directing around. So you can see that most of these are describe calls. Now this one is because SSM is running in that environment. And let's see what we see here. Look at that. You'll notice that this was the instance itself, assuming basically making that API call to try and register itself with SSM. You'll notice that it has a different IP address associated with it as well. I want you to spend a little bit of time looking at this and kind of trying to piece things together, understanding the timestamps and why all of those come in at the same time. I mean, it's just because on the back end, those are really occurring kind of simultaneously. Play with the order a little bit, try and piece it together. But this is reverse chronological order, and you can see all of the non-read actions. So run instances, register manage instance, and terminate instances are kind of the three different actions. And if you look at the differences between the request parameters and the response elements, within the request parameters, for example, in terminate instance, like we said before, it's terminate this instance, and the response is, got to scroll all the way over. I know it's a little awkward to look at it this way. You could actually always download this as a CSV file. And the response is, okay, here's your request ID. This is the instance you asked me to terminate. So it's that call and response is the way to think about it. But if I scroll down to the run instances, so let me go ahead and find that one over here on the left side, run instances, way down at the bottom, you'll notice that the request parameters are what is the image that that instance is based on, what kind of instance, the networking, everything else. Nowhere in here is the instance ID because the instance ID does not exist yet. It does not exist until AWS goes to launch the instance, and then it's going to give you, ignore the reservation ID, but it's going to give you the instance ID in that response. So pretty cool. We now can start with an action. We use that action to figure out. Now, we only had that one terminate instances. If you had many, you'd probably need to filter out, okay, what account was it? Approximately what time was it? Obviously, it's more complex. But we now know when that happened. We know what instance was involved, and we know who did that. It was this crazy RMogul user, or whatever your username is in your account. Then we pulled out that instance ID, and in the query, and I'll scroll back up here to show it on the screen again. In the query, we looked in for every action where that instance was in the request parameters or in the response elements. And that's going to give us every single action that involves that instance. We don't even care the structure of the request parameters or the response elements. Thanks to using those wildcards, as long as that ID is in there, we're going to be able to get what we need. Okay, so there's one last query that I want to cover today. So there's three main entry points when we're doing investigations or when we're building threat detectors. One is, what's the action? Terminate instances, delete objects, whatever that might be. And it can be more complicated than that, but that's the starting point that we're going to work with. The next is the give me everything on a particular resource. Now, that's more for an investigative standpoint. We don't tend to build threat detectors around a specific resource, but that's okay. Now you know how to find a resource in every action, every log file in CloudTrail associated with that resource. Now let's go ahead and see how to do that with identity. So, but going back to the screen, I'm going to hit my plus sign to pull my identity information on, and I'm going to go copy and paste out of the blog post. Okay, so let's check this query out. Now you notice that because it's a structure, we don't just say user identity.arn, and then I pull the ARN for the RMogul user, and we'll go ahead and run that query. And once again, I shall pause while it's running until we get our results. Okay, we've got our results here. So this was 38 seconds. Hey, we're doing pretty good. Every action taken by that user. Now, what's going to be interesting here is that this is every action, and look at this. This is logging into the console. Let's see how far back it goes. So I'm checking dates. So this is still all of just today's dates, and which makes sense. I actually haven't done anything in that workload account in a long time. Now, here's an interesting point. So this gives me all of the actions by that user. What are some things we could look at to see if it was nefarious activity or not? A big one is the IP address, and another big one is the user agent. Let me go ahead. I'm going to add the user agent field. So that is, I think it's just read only resources, event ID, response, user agent. Okay, so it is just in the field, and user agent. I'm going to run it again. There we go, about 44 seconds. And if I scroll over, I think I put the user agent all the way near the end. You can see the account ID. So I could look for, these are always going to be the same the way I ran this query. I'm going to show you why in just a moment. And then you can see there's changing user agents. So my browser, AWS internal, so that's kind of normal. User agents, like changing IP addresses, can be valuable to help you potentially identify if somebody is coming in from a nefarious or a different location. So watching for trends and changes in that user agent, obviously skipping the AWS internal part, that can also potentially be indicative of an attack. And now all of you know that I'm running on a Mac. Oh, no surprise there. Let's go up, and I'm going to show you one last query. And this one's going to be ugly in the responses. Click the plus button, and then paste in the final query from the blog post. This is going to look for any user identity that has RMogul in the ARN, which is our SSO user. And again, this isn't as reliable as knowing the specific ARN, but the key difference is if you looked at the previous query, I'll click over on it here, it's using the ARN, Amazon resource name, which actually has the account ID embedded in it. And then the name of the role also has some random characters that are added to it. Well, in this case, we're just going to look for that RMogul user in the user identity. Now, if there was an IAM user with the name RMogul or in there, this could create other issues, but that's all right for what we're doing for these purposes. Running the query, and I'm going to pause. The query itself didn't really take any longer because for all of our queries, because nothing's partitioned, we've been looking over all of the logs all the time anyway. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see there are 9,744 results. And one of the interesting things about this is, let me zoom out. If I scroll all the way over to the account ID, as I move down, you will probably see, hopefully see, if I didn't lie. Oops, I've got to move on to another page here. And we start hopefully getting some other account IDs involved. So, yep, and there we go. So you can see that we're actually getting multiple account IDs because now I'm searching for any activity by that user anywhere. Now, that's not one you would use for a while, but I just wanted to show it to emphasize the point that when we're dealing with an organization trail, we have access to all of the logs everywhere. Okay, I just threw a lot at you, and what do I want you to take away from this? There are 3 core queries that we learned about today, and they're designed to show us what it looks like in those particular important fields in the CloudTrail logs. One is we know how to query based on we know what the action is. We now know how to look for all of the activity around a particular resource, and we now know how to look at all of the activity around a particular user. Now, there is a lot more to it. And well, in this case, it's a role, an SSO user. There's a lot more to running these queries, but that basis of how to run them, and I'm going to pull over and just go into the query itself. In the select statement is what are the things that we want? You could list everything there, or you saw that I played with these a little bit to actually just list particular fields. The where clause always needs to be your database table. The from clause. And then the where clause is the magic of what we're looking for. We use these likes and these wildcards a lot in incident response and in building threat detectors. So the first query, very straightforward. We're looking for the exact name of terminate instances. And I could have put some time bounds on these. And in a real incident, I probably would. I wouldn't necessarily need, everything. But for our purposes, I did want everything just because we're working in a smaller environment. Then we learned about the request parameters and the response elements and how to use our like clauses and our wildcard, that percentage sign in there. Then we learned how to query based on a user role specifically, just in one account, that role. And then we also learned how to run a query in a more generic way that's going to be for that user anywhere in the environment. That's just the basis we want to cover. And as we get deeper into this, we're going to get into more specific queries. Over on the blog post, I also linked through to my process for incident investigation. We're actually going to do a fake incident investigation. You're going to use all the queries that I built there, and I'll walk you through that entire process. But if you want to get a peek ahead and look at some other queries, feel free to do so. Anyway, bit of a different lab this week, almost all hands on. Hopefully you enjoyed it.